Welcome to the second part of the 2025 Bampton Lectures, Wading in the Word, Womanist Biblical Interpretations. Welcome to those of you physically here and all of those of you watching live stream. I'm Jane Shaw and I'm chair of the Bampton Trust, and it's a really great pleasure to welcome once again our 2025 lecturer, the Reverend Professor Will Gaffney. Professor Gaffney is the Right Reverend Sam B. Hulsey Professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, a much admired and distinguished biblical scholar who has published widely in the area of biblical interpretation. She's the author of several books, A Woman's Lectionary for the Whole Church, Years A, B, and C, and a novel, Year W, a standalone volume, for which she translated the relevant biblical selections. Womanist Midrash, a reintroduction to women of the Torah and of the throne, and its sequel, Womanist Midrash, a reintroduction to women of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, along with a commentary on Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah in the Wisdom series, and her first book, Daughters of Miriam, Women Prophets in Ancient Israel. Professor Gaffney is also an Episcopal priest. The honors she has received for her work include in 2019 the Anna Julia Haywood Cooper honor from the Union of Black Episcopalians, awarded for her scholarship and advocacy on matters of race and gender. And in 2020, the Society of Biblical Literature, the main society for biblical scholars in America, named her one of the two recipients of its first Outstanding Mentor Award. Professor Gaffney's first two Bampton Lectures delivered last week were greatly enjoyed and engendered much discussion here and behind the scenes with those of you watching live stream. I heard from quite a lot of you how much you'd enjoyed them. If you did not catch those first two lectures and would like to, you can view them on the University Church website. We now very much look forward to Professor Gaffney's third lecture, A World Beneath the Waves, Womanist Midrash. No handout for this lecture, and we'll repeat the pattern from last week with a break from 11 to 11:30, returning then at 11:30 for the final lecture of the series. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Gaffney back to the podium.
Thank you, Principal Shaw, and thank all of you who have come out and those of you who are joining virtually this morning. Our series title is Wading in the Word, Womanist Biblical Interpretation. For this lecture, we will wade out as far as we can and peer through the waters, or perhaps take a ride on a glass-bottomed boat. We are interested in the world beneath the waves, and that is the title of today's lecture, A World Beneath the Waves, Womanist Midrash. The etymological roots of womanist and womanism is womanish. Alice Walker explains her derivation in part 2 of her second and most well-known definition. From womanish, the opposite of girlish, i.e., frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A black feminist or feminist of color. From the black folk expression of mothers to female children, you act in womanish, i.e., like a woman, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior. Wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. Interested in grown-up doings, acting up, being grown up, interchangeable with another black folk expression, you trying to be grown. Responsible, in charge, serious. As grown women, womanists are also outrageous, audacious, courageous, and willful, from Walker's earlier definition of the term. We are the daughters of black folk who white folk in North America, and I would dare say Europe, would say didn't know our place. We have a history of wanting to know more and in greater depth than those who would have kept us illiterate, and they did for a while. I believe the United States of America is the only country in which there were laws on the books forbidding literacy, but only for Black folk. Womanists have always wanted to know more than what someone else, particularly those in social, cultural, and economic hierarchies, determined was good for us. We wanted to read. And while we were learning, we built institutions, colleges, universities, seminaries, museums, theaters, and churches in which we could not preach. And we pursued higher education and continue to do so above all other demographics in the United States. And whether it was integrating a segregated school as a little girl or being the first Black woman with a PhD from this or that institution, first Black woman to gain tenure, first Black woman to be promoted to full professor, to have an endowed chair named after her, at every step and every stage, womanists have sought knowledge with which other folk told us not to bother our woolly little heads. The era of those firsts has not yet ended. There are still Black women accomplishing something that no one like her has before in education and in the world beyond. And with each first, we are questioned, our intellectual capacity, our ability to function as an executive, our competency to lead a college or seminary that is anything more than on the verge of financial ruin and collapse, let alone the most powerful nation for the moment in the world. Yet in whatever circumstance we found and find ourselves, we still manage to be audacious and courageous, sometimes outrageous, while setting worldwide trends culturally, musically, and sartorially. Even when prevented from undertaking study in what some have regarded as the most difficult, and according to my first Hebrew professor, the most despotic academic discipline in the field of religious studies, Hebrew Bible. My professor, the Reverend Dr. Gene Rice of Howard University School of Divinity, told me, even as he celebrated my acceptance into several graduate schools, Hebrew Bible is the last realm of despotism in the civilized world. The Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon told her story repeatedly before her death of how she completed her coursework and passed her exams in Hebrew Bible, but was prevented from pursuing her dissertation and pushed out of the program, forced to start all over again in theology. There would not be that Black woman in Hebrew Bible. She told me repeatedly not to let them put me out of Hebrew Bible. She wanted to know more and in greater depth than was considered good for her. And I do too. Every time Dr. Rice, my Hebrew Bible professor, shared some tidbits that was under the surface of the text as though it were under the waves, and we needed to be willing to put our face in the waters or hire a glass-bottom boat to see it, to touch it, to hold it, to understand it, was an advertisement for his Hebrew class. And I shamelessly advertised my Hebrew class. I wanted to know more about the biblical text than what the translators of it told me. For I had known that the black and beautiful translation of Psalm 1:5 in the King James Bible was wrong. Since I was a child, I knew it in my bones with no external or academic confirmation. I wanted to be able to read scripture for myself without an intermediary. In reading for myself, I became a womanist, reading from my identity and experience in culture and coming to some different conclusions than translators who share none of those elements with me. In my becoming, I became enamored of rabbinic literature and classical rabbinic exegesis and midrash. What drew me was the deep engagement with the biblical text, letter by letter, vowel by vowel, cantillation mark by cantillation mark. Even the spaces between the letters speak if you know how to read them in black fire on white fire. If literacy was never intended for me, if higher education was never intended for me, if teaching, correcting, and instructing white students was never for me, then surely advanced studies in rabbinic literature was not for me. But I've always been womanish and not overly concerned about the expectations others held up for me or the restrictions they wished to put upon me. But in my African American culture, especially at the nexus of the two different kinds of Southern lineage that produced me, my womanish ways were nurtured and indulged. One of the tenets of womanism is flourishing. Our common goal is our own flourishing, that of our collective children and families, that of our people, and that of the communities in which we live. In that way, we are also dedicated to the flourishing of those who wish us ill, because we seek flourishing of our community so widely that there is no one it does not exclude unless they exclude and exempt themselves. My upbringing set me up to flourish in hostile territory, and my particular exegetical approach, Womanist Midrash, is an autobiographical approach to the text in some measure. This particular hermeneutic is an outgrowth of my experience in pulpit and pew with the sanctified imagination in Black preaching and the decade I spent as a member of a synagogue participating in Torah discussions and doing Torah teaching. The sanctified imagination is a specific practice of Black preaching. The sanctified imagination emerges from a literalist piety, yet allows the preacher to move beyond the strictures of the text with the invocation of the sanctified imagination. So, for example, a preacher would say, "In my sanctified imagination," and the hand gesture of cupping your ear as one hears or mimics hearing from the divine is a part of it. In my sanctified imagination, I see Bathsheba always walking with her head held high, and David never ever able to meet her eyes, right? So it's a going beyond the text, but that invocation of the term allows the congregation to go with you, even if they have very narrow views about the text. My exegetical approach in this project, Womanist Midrash, the 2 volumes to which you heard reference, is inspired by midrashic approaches in rabbinic literature, their translations and their interpretations, particularly the fact that they are for religious readers. My approach combines translation-based exegesis with literary and contextual, ancient and contemporary readings of the biblical text as scripture. I offer a note on translating in the appendix of each volume. As religious readings, rabbinic readings discern value in text, words, and individual letters as potential revelatory spaces. They reimagine dominant narratival readings while crafting new ones to stand alongside but not replace former readings. Midrash also asks questions of the text. Sometimes it provides answers, sometimes it leaves the reader to provide their own answers. My friend and Hebrew Biblical Studies colleague, Dr. Mark Brummett, here today, coined the term Womanist Midrash for my work, and I'm indebted to him for it. The expression captures my articulation of a womanist hermeneutic influenced by classical, rabbinic, and continuing contemporary midrash. Specifically, a womanist midrash is a set of interpretive practices, including translation, exegesis, and biblical interpretation that attends to marginalized characters in biblical narratives, especially women and girls, intentionally including and centering non-Israelite peoples and enslaved peoples. Womanist Midrash listens to and for their voices in and through the Hebrew Bible, while acknowledging that often the text does not speak or even intend to speak to or for them, let alone hear them. In the tradition of rabbinic midrash and contemporary feminist biblical scholarship, Womanist Midrash offers names for anonymized characters and crafts, listens for, gives voice to those characters. This particular hermeneutic, Womanist Midrash, is an outgrowth of my experience from pulpit to pew with the sanctified imagination in Black preaching. I have come to recognize that the sanctified imagination is itself a form of African American indigenous midrash. Like classical contemporary Jewish midrash, the sacred imagination tells the story behind the story between the lines on the page. The sanctified imagination is the fertile creative space where the preacher-interpreter enters the text, particularly the spaces in the text, and fills them out with missing details, names, backstories, detailed descriptions of the scene and characters, and so on. For example, the sanctified imagination reveals that Rachel was athletic and long-legged. The sanctified imagination reveals that Samson's locks were dreadlocks. A preacher may engage in the practice without a formal disclosure, signaling it with extreme or asynchronous descriptions. For example, Joseph's chariot wheels as doves or 22s, an overly large tire popular in the United States among a certain element. The invocation of the sanctified imagination also gives permission to the community to resist the exegetical license taken by the preacher without resisting or critiquing the sermon as a whole. As sanctified imagination in this womanist midrash is rooted in the Afro diaspora, especially in the Black church, which is itself a dynamic, diverse collection of peoples and practices with elusive boundaries, a womanist engagement looks to the experiences and articulations of Black women throughout the diaspora, but in this particular work, focusing on the Americas as an authoritative source and norm for biblical interpretation. As a womanist who talks back to the text, sometimes I, like the rabbis before me and the pseudepigraphal scribes before them, and those who told and preserved different versions of the sacred stories in Canaanite languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, I find that I must lean into my sanctified imagination, that cultural practice of Black preaching, and offer an alternative to the text when it is flagrantly violent, when it objectifies, silences, or erases women, and when it traffics in human beings. And sometimes academic exegesis and analysis is insufficient to the horror and difficulty of the text. Sometimes the text needs a new story altogether. I engage a three-layer process in my work, most readily exemplified in the 2 volumes of Womanist Midrash. The first is a study of the text in its original language along with related texts such as the ancient Greek Septuagint, the ancient Aramaic Peshitta, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other significant Hebrew language manuscripts, followed by translation, often with footnotes addressing the differences in those manuscripts and which reading I prefer and why. A process not always done or acknowledged by other translators. As readers, even as highly technical readers, we don't always know why translators choose what they choose, particularly when they make a choice that is at odds with sort of the main body of extant translation. The second layer is commentary on the text, a detailed analysis, and then follows the third layer, a womanist midrash in which I speak back to the text. In practical terms, not every text in these 2 volumes has the third layer. only those that meet the requirements above, the kind of violence, dehumanization, horror, and sorrow that I simply cannot ignore. Some of these speak against the brutality of the text and recontextualize it as is common in the rabbinic midrashim. In a women's lectionary for the whole church, which will be the subject of our next lecture, I often choose psalms that speak for silent or injured women in the text. Now, back to Womanist Midrash, I offer 2 readings from the 2nd volume. The first is Gilead's Women. Judges chapter 11, verse 1. Now Yiftach, the Gileadite, the son of a woman, a prostitute, was a mighty warrior. Gilad was the father of Yiftach, and Yiftach is Jephthah. Gilad's wife gave birth to 2 sons for him, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Yiftach away. They said to him, "You shall not inherit anything in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Let me also say that in my practice of naming biblical characters, I name them phonetically in their own language, Hebrew. I do not use anglicized names. And the names of biblical characters in an English Bible come through a melange of languages. So that if we were to take the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all begin with different letters in English, but in Hebrew they all begin with the same letter, a yud, the Y sound. And so we get Isaiah through Latin, Jeremiah through German, Ezekiel a little bit through Latin, but they didn't know what to do with the guttural sound of a letter we don't have. And so those names look nothing like where they came from. So my names, Yiftach for Jephthah and Gilad for Gilead, are their Hebrew names with Hebrew pronunciations. Readers who are unfamiliar with the horrific violence in Judges, readers who are familiar with the horrific violence in Judges know the story of Bat Yiftach, Jephthah's daughter. Her story begins with a recitation of her father's genealogy and a few details about his family of origin, including his father, Gilead, and the women in his life. The women in their shared family history connect their own troubled narratives to hers. There is her grandmother, the sex worker who had a child, her father, with a man who also had children with another woman. Then there is that next woman with whom he partnered, whom he married, and with whom he lived in a household with their children, and the child he had with the sex worker, her father's stepmother. There is the woman with whom the formerly stigmatized child had his own child when he became an adult, her mother, though nothing is said of her. And there is the daughter, born to the unknown woman. These are all Gilead's women, and they are all Bat Yiftach's own womenfolk. Bat Yiftach, Jephthah's daughter, is also one of Gilead's womenfolk. She is his granddaughter, though it is difficult to imagine him acknowledging her after allowing his own sons to drive her father away. The end of this same chapter will narrate the circumstances of her death at the hands of her father as a human sacrifice offered to God. The women with whom Gilead had children have had their names stripped from them in the telling of the stories in which they appear as background, accessories, and provocations. The first woman entangled with Gilead is used to demean Yiftach in Yiftach's genealogy. You know, his mama's a whore and used by Gilead for sex work. The sequence of their introductions is telling. Yiftach is a whoreson, and his mother exists in the text only as a badge of shame. Gilead's paternity of Yiftach is then grudgingly acknowledged, and after the text acquiesces that Yiftach is a mighty warrior, just like his father. Gilead's consort with at least one sex worker is acknowledged but not critiqued. In truth, there were no Israelite prohibitions against men buying sex. Nothing else of this consort is known. How long she and Gilad were together, her name, her people. Of the last, if she were a Canaanite, she would be a stereotype, a promiscuous foreign woman, despite being an indigenous person in her own land. Alternatively, if she were an Israelite, she would have been reduced to sex work through poverty, abandonment, or lack of supporting male relatives. Though they have extensive backstories, there are many questions about Gilad and Yiftach that spur my womanist imagination. Among them are, how was Gilad's paternity of Yiftach established? At what age Yiftach went to live with his father and his father's new wife? And what happened to his mother after he was taken from her? It does appear that there is any uncertainty about Yiftach's paternity. His brothers do not question it, even when throwing him out of the family home. His mother may have been a sex worker, but she seems to have had only one customer long enough for everyone to know that her child was Gilad's. While it only takes a single sexual encounter to conceive, it is difficult to imagine Gilad would claim the child of a sex worker he had only visited once or who was known to have many clients. Is Gilad taking resources away from his family to pay for his service relationship with a sex worker? Does he continue having sex with her after he takes their child? Does he patronize other sex workers? How does Yiftach's mother feel about having her child taken away from her? Does it cause her great grief? Or did she want to be rid of him so that she could return to sex work? Did Gilad offer her any compensation? A further question is whether the two women, wife and sex worker, have overlapping sexual relationships with Gilad at the same time, neither uncommon in the biblical world nor in our own. The sequence in which the text introduces the women and their offspring suggests they be read in series. Yiftach is Gilad's firstborn son, further reason for him to claim him if he were certain of paternity. The lack of successive progeny with the first woman after the birth announcement of the second woman suggests an end to one relationship and the consummation of another. At some point after the birth of their son, Yiftach, Gilad takes him from his mother and raises him with his two sons with his wife. These relationships would have been serial as I construct them. Then Gilad would have brought his outside child home to his new wife sometime after weaning, if not as an older child. How did his wife feel about all of that? Was her discontent motivation for her sons driving him out? How did Gilad's wife feel about raising a child that was not hers? Was he still in some sort of relationship with the boy's mother? Israelite men, like their counterparts throughout the ancient Afro-Asiatic world, had legitimate sexual access to their slaves and servants and could have many children with different mothers living on the same family compound. The scriptures document regular friction between women who share conjugal relationships with the same man. See Jacob's wives and their enslaved women, and Hannah and Peninnah. How long did it take his wife to conceive her first child? Did the boys grow up close in age, or was there a significant gap between them? Lastly, how long did Yiftach live with his father? The vocabulary of the driving out, which seems to call for physical force, is the same term that's used for herding animals. But it also may refer to a strong conflict. The boys would have had to grow up quite a bit for them to be able to drive their older brother out. Where was Gilad when his sons broke up his household? Has he died? Did Gilad's wife have to live with conflict for years, a decade or more? It is clear that her sons resented their half-brother's presence, throwing them out as soon as they could, perhaps when their father died. The text does not address his death or life beyond the genealogy of Yiftach. The questions of the preceding 2 paragraphs arose out of a need to understand the Yiftach character and render him comprehensible. This is an imperative for me as a womanist reader because Yiftach is part of the community every bit as much as his daughter is. We cannot have one without the other. Our families and communities include those who hurt us, sometimes to the most horrific degree. Our prisons are full of the guilty as well as the innocent. The womanist commitment to the well-being of our communities must include those of our parents, partners, and progeny who have caused us harm within appropriate parameters. Understanding how Yiftach became the man he did is a womanist question every bit as much as what he did or did not do to his daughter. Whether Yiftach never saw his birth mother again or lived near enough to see her, whether she was a refuge for him or abandoned him to his new home, Yiftach was certainly affected by his mothering or the lack of it. This is true whether she was alive or dead when he married, became a parent, and later when he killed his own daughter. The shadow of his father also looms large over him. None of the women of Gilad have names in the text. The names I chose for them reflect the possibilities of who they were or could have been outside of these verses. I call Yiftach's mother and Gilad's commercial sex partner Talia, a Canaanite name incorporating the word for dew in biblical Hebrew. And I call Gilad's wife Uzzah, strength. There's no way of knowing the ethnicity of either woman. I imagine there was some overlap between these women and that they were aware of each other. And in my sanctified imagination, I see these women coming together in the market for an uncomfortable conversation observed with glee by everyone in town. Talia walks through the market, drawing eyes, but turning down solicitations. Soft fabric, richly embroidered, swirls around her as she walks with her head held high. She jingles as she walks, her wrists and ankles caressed by tinkling bangles. Uzzah browses fruit stalls with a child on her hip that looks nothing like her. Talia sees her and makes a beeline towards her. The market quiets. Some stare openly. Others pretend not to. Talia wraps her arms around herself to keep from reaching out to the child who cries when he sees her and reaches for her. Others pretend not to see. Talia says to Uzzah, I was once like you. I had a home, a family. You were just one misfortune away from walking in my sandals. Whatever you think of me, don't take it out on my child. None of us have a choice in this thing. Treat my boy like you would want someone to treat your child. Uzzah to Talia, I'm sorry. Talia is already walking away. The little boy sobs inconsolably, Ima, 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 the word for mother. Peninnah and her daughters. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. Now, there was a particular man of Ramathaim of Tzophim from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah ben Yeroham ben Elihu ben Tohu ben Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 women. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the second was Peninnah. And it was that Peninnah had children, but for Hannah there were no children. Now, it was the day on which Elkanah would offer sacrifice, and he gave portions to Peninnah his woman and to all her daughters and sons. But to Hannah he gave an additional portion because he loved her, because the Holy One of old had closed her womb. Now her rival vexed her vexation for the sake of producing contention, because the Holy One had closed her womb. In all of my hearings of the story of Hannah and Shmuel, Samuel, Peninnah has always been the villain in the text. She is inscribed in the text as the other woman in 1 Samuel. Peninnah provokes the righteous Hannah because of her infertility, which she cannot control, vexing her. On the one hand, Peninnah represents the cultural norms of her people. On the other hand, she and her body belong to a man who uses her sexually, has children with her, and does not love her. Moreover, he publicly shames her by stating his love for someone else. In some ways, the reading of Peninnah's story is dependent on whether one understands her to be the first or the second wife. In a typical scenario, Hannah would have been the first wife and Peninnah taken on because of Hannah's infertility, which is supported by 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2, in which Peninnah is identified as the second woman or wife. In this reading, Peninnah does what a faithful Israelite woman is supposed to do, bear children, particularly sons. She has produced at least an heir and a spare. Her daughters and sons number at least 2 of each. The text does not say if Elkanah withdrew from Peninnah once Hannah conceived her child. That would be extremely unlikely. He may have understood himself to owe her as many children as possible to counter high infant and child mortality and to provide for her in her old age. Thus, I read that Peninnah continued to faithfully provide children for Elkanah. She continued to welcome him into her bed, and like Leah of old, in hopes that he would one day love her. The least likely possibility is that Peninnah is the first wife. This interpretation suggests that she, in her fertility, did not satisfy something in her husband, and he sought out another woman who was more to his liking. And when that new woman proved incompetent by cultural standards at what was understood to be her basic duty, her husband did not discard her, but rather kept her and loved her, which enraged Peninnah bitterly. This interpretation requires an understanding of the expression, the one woman and the second, as purely idiomatic and not sequential. Both Hannah and Peninnah live in an androcentric, regularly patriarchal society. They are each assessed by women and men alike on their ability to provide children and perhaps to a lesser degree on their physical appearance. In many ways, polygamy encourages competition. They play the game with the hand they are given. My Womanist Midrashic reading considers what would have happened if Hannah and Peninnah had found a way to change the game. Sometime after giving birth to a second child for Elkanah, Peninnah realizes that he does not love her. He loves that other woman, Hannah, who has not done what a woman ought to do. And so he keeps coming back to her bed and to her thighs, because she can do what a woman ought to do, and she will do it. But not anymore. Peninnah closes her heart and closes her thighs, and she opens her mouth. She tells him that she has done her duty. She has provided him with an heir and a spare. She will raise them, nurture them, love them, teach and train them, but she will not add to them. When Elkanah returns to Hannah's bed, frustrated that Peninnah has denied him access, he discovers that Peninnah has been there too. It is her voice that he hears in Hannah's mouth when she asks him, "If you love me so much more than 7 sons, why are you still slipping into her bed?" Having no answer, he withdraws, and for once, Hannah and Peninnah sleep in their own beds on their own terms. What this looks like in a sermon, I won't preach the whole sermon. Elkanah loved Hannah, but he seemed to have no love for Peninnah. He commiserated with Hannah over the pain in her heart from the emptiness of her womb. And he demonstrated his love for her publicly, but more than that, he demonstrated his partiality and preference for her and her love, her hurts and her hopes, in Peninnah's face before God and everyone else when they went to worship. In biblical language, he put Peninnah to shame when she had done nothing wrong and everything right. And so she acted out. She acted out against the one who symbolized her hurt, but not against the one whose power hurt her and kept her in her hurt. And that's how patriarchy and other systems of power work. They keep the people at the bottom fighting each other rather than joining together to fight the systems that trap us. If you asked Peninnah, she might have told you she was willing to get by on the crumbs of love that fell from the table of Hannah and Elkanah's love. In fact, the gospel lesson with which this lesson is paired in the women's lectionary is the story of a woman begging Jesus for crumbs of healing like a dog begging for scraps under the master's table. In that story, what looks like a stingy love for some soon becomes a full-throated, open-hearted love, embracing everyone and welcoming them to the table. Peninnah's story is a story of hard truths that looks more like the world in which we live today than Hannah's story. Peninnah teaches us that you can do what's right so far as you know and still get your heart broken. She teaches us that people with power will almost always choose power and use that power to get what they want, no matter who they hurt. And she teaches that no system of domination survives on the power of the powerful alone. Rather, patriarchy survives because patriarchal women embrace its bankrupt promises in order to get a little privilege, just as some black folk and people of many colors embrace white supremacist cultural values in the hopes of being granted the perilous protection of being counted as one of the good ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. We do have a bit of time for questions, and there's a roving mic. And I think I'll begin with a bit of an echo of a question from last week, which is how those without biblical languages can exercise particularly this third stage of sanctified imagination.
So that is a perilous prospect. There are lots of folk who write what they say is midrash, and it's basically fanfic, just imaginations, right? Because midrash is a Jewish practice, a specific kind of biblical exegesis, it really belongs in the hands of those trained to do it. But of course, anyone can think imaginatively about the text, and it's important to not adopt the language beyond one's competency. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way for people who don't have that kind of training, but it becomes important when those of us in the Christian world handle the sacred text of Judaism because we have a Christian hierarchy with which we have done terrible and horrific things. So we need to be responsible. But one can ask questions of the text. If you remember, my primary reading of the Jephthah story was, I have all these questions about these women and these men, right? So ask the questions, and then suggest answers. And I would not get hung up on the term sanctified imagination, which for me is a practice of black preaching. I understand some other folk engage in it. But think richly, deeply, and imaginatively about the text, and everyone can do that. I might as well stay up here.
Stay up there, yeah.
Yes, I'm getting my exercises on the steps.
Thank you, Dr. Gaffney. My name is Dr. Melanie Harris, and I'm a womanist colleague from the United States of America. My son is sleeping, John Asante Harris. It's a gift and an honor to be here. One of the greatest contributions that you give to womanism and womanist religious thought is this doorway into interreligious dialogue. It is astonishing for many womanists coming out of the Christian world that the Midrash and Jewish texts are even accessible to many African American women. Would you mind speaking a bit to the interreligious door that your work opens itself up to?
Certainly. And Dr. Harris, I was looking at you and deciding my eyes were playing tricks on me. And I must say that the sleeping John Asante is a child for which I had the pleasure of being a sponsor at his christening. So I am not crying at all. I think the best way to answer it is a bit autobiographically. When I was in divinity school, I was in a program called Seminarians Interacting that was initially Jews and Christians and later Muslim students. And in the program, we would go to each other's seminaries, or in the case of the Muslim students, School of Religious Sciences, participate in a class. We would be invited to whatever kind of authentic religious service was most inclusive. So, we didn't have Eucharist, we had, morning prayer, something that all people could be present for. And then at the end of the year, we would have a conference, and the themes were, how do you raise up children in your tradition? What is death and dying like in your system? So that rich engagement was the first place I started to hear the Torah chanted and started to realize there's things going in here linguistically that I'm not getting in English. The relationship that I founded there with eventually Rabbi Fred Daub became one of family blending, and I began attending synagogue very shortly after that. And so the synagogue that I was a member of for 10 years in Philly was one in which the Devar Torah was conversational. So the darshan would do a little piece, and then everyone would discuss it. Can you imagine being in a congregation where almost everyone is literate in Hebrew, and people are coming in with armfuls of commentaries under their arms? It was full of seminary faculty and rabbis in training at the rabbinic school. So that very rich multicultural and interreligious practice of the decades is really where I set myself. It's also been, as much as I call on white folk to use their privilege to dismantle white supremacy and men to use their privilege to dismantle patriarchy, I feel a particular onus, even though in Christianity I'm in the marginalized corner, to speak out against anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and that's something I've done for a long time, and it means that I have space in both Judaism and Christianity, certain sorts of Judaism, so that I can speak and be heard on very difficult issues like the genocide in Gaza. So, because now that there's a family involvement and just my longstanding commitment, I continue to walk in both of the spaces and calling each other to account in certain ways. I hope that gets at what you're asking. Maybe I'll just step over.
Any more questions? In that case, we will break for the tea and coffee. And I just want to remind you once again that Professor Gaffney is allergic to coffee. So if you have a cup of coffee, you have to stay over there with it. If you want to talk to her while having your beverage, you need to have a nice cup of tea. And for those of you who are watching at home, we hope you'll take your own tea and coffee break now and come back at 11:30 for the fourth and final lecture. Thank you very much.